So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining in and listening to learn a bit more about Agrimin today, and also to learn more about global food security, which is a thematic that is emerging alongside electrification. Since I joined Agrimin just over a year ago, I've certainly learned a lot more about it, and I look forward to sharing some of that with you today. So Agrimin, we're based in Australia and we are listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. And today I'm going to talk you through the three major components of our company, but I will be focusing on food security and potash. So in Western Australia, we have an asset called Lake Mackay, and the Lake Mackay asset is the largest potash-bearing salt lake in the world that is yet to be developed. So it's the largest undeveloped natural resource of potash in the world from an inland salt lake, and that's our major focus for Agrimin development, and I'll talk you through those upcoming milestones. We also, in addition to having Lake Mackay, have multi-commodity exploration upside across our tenure, and we also have a very valuable investment portfolio through a privately owned company called Tali, who own 13% of WA1 Resources, and I'll talk you through their recent niobium discovery just near our lake as well. So jumping into the food security thematic, and certainly, as I mentioned, I've only been with Agrimin just over a year, and I was unaware of a lot of this information prior to going through the recruitment process and joining the company. But the global food security thematic is something that we should all be focusing on, and we should all be quite concerned by. There is significant focus in the critical mineral space on electrification, but there are countries that are starting to understand that food security and the critical mineral inflow for agriculture is just as important. So if you look at the overall trends, and none of the trends will come as a surprise, we do have a growing population, we do have less arable land, and those two are linked, and we do also have an increase in the demand for fresh fruit and vegetables. Now, that particularly comes from what is termed the growing middle class around the world. So there is a middle class that have access to more disposable income and are seeking access to more fresh food. So when you look at all of that, coupled with the fact that we are seeing some environmental trend changes and potentially impacts of climate change, then what we do need to focus on is getting more from less. So the way that we can improve the food security situation is by increasing yield, and that is where good fertilisers come into the storyline. So in terms of fertilisers, there are many different kinds. We do sometimes get confused with phosphate, so I'll just be very clear that we are a potash company. And similarly, potash gets talked about in the global media a lot as a singular term and doesn't delineate between the two major forms of potash. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes explaining the difference, because it's important in terms of the market share and also the supply-demand equation. So our Mackay project is a sulfate of potash project. So that's the premium potash fertiliser because it's chloride-free. So for a chloride-free fertiliser, we are obviously suitable for chloride-intolerant crops, and that is namely fruits, vegetables and nuts. So the market is a lot smaller because it is a premium fertiliser, so it has a much more bespoke application. However, it trades at a much higher price. So at the moment, it's around $620. It's been hovering between $620 and $640 a tonne US in recent times. The other form of potash, which people are probably more familiar with, is muriate of potash, or MOP. So that is, both have potassium in them. However, muriate of potash contains chloride. So it has a different distribution. So it's for broad grain crop distribution. So it's a much larger market, but it's not suitable for the more high-end categories of agriculture like fruit and vegetables. So in terms of the market for MOP, while it's 10 times the size of SOP, it is well supplied. An example of a development for MOP at the moment, which some people will be familiar with, is the BHP Jansen project in Saskatoon in Canada. Now that's an $11 billion US investment by BHP, and that is an MOP project. Now, when they're up and producing from their full capacity, they will be 10% of the global market of MOP out of the BHP Jansen facility. In terms of SOP, our Lake Mackay in Western Australia, when we are up in operation, we will be 6% of global supply from Western Australia, from that one inland salt lake. So market share is different. However, key factor at the moment for SOP, and the reason that the price is high and steady at that rate, is because the supply-demand equation is under pressure. So what we've seen this year particularly is the spot market. There is no spot market because everything has been consumed, and we're seeing normal suppliers of SOP stopping exporting because they need it all for domestic consumption. So while sulfate of potash is under pressure because demand is outstripping supply, the MOP market has enough supply and has enough new developments coming online that's foreseeable into the future that the market will be stable. We do often get asked the question, can you make SOP? So I'm just going to talk through, yes, you can. It's a secondary process, or it's sometimes called the Mannheim process. So I'll just start with an overview of how we will be creating our SOP. So that's the top section of this slide. So we will be doing what is called primary SOP production. It relies on a solar evaporation process. So we have, as I've mentioned, a large inland lake. We have a trenching system. We have 40 square kilometres of solar evaporation ponds, and we have a processing plant on site. Now that does obviously need power and water, but at the mine gate, we have organic fertiliser ready to use. So the project has very strong ESG credentials. It has very good fit in terms of our renewable footprint, our carbon footprint, and most of the energy that we're using is coming from the sun through the solar evaporation ponds. Now, you can create SOP from MOP, and that's the process shown on the bottom half of the slide. Now, with MOP, it is a much more expensive process to convert it into SOP because obviously, first of all, you have to develop the MOP, then you need to transport it somewhere, and then you need to actually secondary process it in what is called a Mannheim furnace. So that process needs significant amount of energy because it's a very high temperature processing unit, and it also requires sulfuric acid. Now, the more difficult aspect of this secondary production is that a byproduct is hydrochloric acid, which is very hard to dispose of. And if you look at the entire process from start to finish, it has nowhere near the ESG credentials that the primary production system does. So Mannheim production has been reducing around the globe. So it's either been restricted or fully stopped in jurisdictions because of the environmental outcomes and because of the fact that the byproduct of hydrochloric acid is very difficult to deal with as a waste substance. So just to put our lake into a bit of perspective, so what you can see on this chart is the current major producers around the world. Some of you may be familiar with the ones on the left-hand side of Agrimin there around Compass, Salt Lake, most people have heard of. So they're currently in production and they've been in production for many decades. So a lot of those lakes are suffering now from environmental challenges and also just the quality of their product. So some of these lakes actually put MOP into the salt lakes to improve the potassium quality. So some of those lakes are struggling with production. And when you look from Lake Mackay down, you can see that there's no other large-scale developments either been already up and running or due to be developed. So in terms of the lake, it's actually 100 kilometres by 80 kilometres. It's quite a spectacular site. It's a white salt lake sitting in the middle of the Western Australian desert, which is a very red countryside. So we say that you can see it from space, which you certainly can. You can Google map it and you can see it from space. So it's a very large lake surface. The food security thematic, as I mentioned, is increasing. The number of countries that are classifying potash as a critical mineral is increasing. And there are certain countries around the world as well that have food security strategies specific for a time horizon of 2030 and subsequently 2050. So we are well positioned now to develop the Mackay project. We're in a geopolitically stable environment in Australia. And that is actually a key point because I think most of the world assumed that the SOP that we needed would come from East African developments. So there's very large resource available there. However, for geopolitical stability issues and also technical challenges, those projects are not being progressed at all. So we are the largest undeveloped and we're poised to be ready to take FID. So just getting a little bit more into the actual project itself. So we're located just over 900 kilometres from the nearest port. Now, I know for people, particularly in Europe, that sounds like a very scary distance, but for us in Australia, we're used to talking about large distances, and certainly in the mining sector, we're used to managing large logistics chains. So the way that the Mackay project will be developed is the lake, as I mentioned, will have a trenching system and a solar evaporation pond system. We will have a processing plant on site. So at the mine gate, we will have ready to use organically certified sulfate of potash. We then control a logistics chain that goes from the lake all the way up to the Port of Wyndham. We have a joint venture partner to conduct that road train fleet with us. And part of our project is building a 340-kilometre private road, which then connects to the state highway system in Western Australia. Some of those roads are going through upgrade at the moment through a lot of our advocacy, so that we have fully sealed and secure tenure for the project, but also transport to the port. At the port, we have freehold land, so we will have full mine gate to ship logistics control. We have all of our native title agreements in place. So in Australian jurisdictions, a very important facet of any mining development is agreements with the Indigenous peoples of the land. We have those agreements in place and they're in good standing, and we have very close relationships with them. I'll talk a little bit more about our history in the region shortly. A key factor also in Australia is environmental approvals, and I'm going to talk you through the process that we've been on to get to where we are and the next steps in that process. It has been quite time consuming and at times frustrating, but we do have line of sight now to our primary environmental approvals, and that is the last thing we need to unlock progressing the project further. So I'll start with the environmental approvals. So you can see a few milestones here. So in 2019, we referred the project to the regulator. That is a process that you must undertake. When you refer, you then get a level of control deemed. So we were deemed a controlled action, which is the highest level of due diligence that can be done on environmental approval. Now, leading into actually progressing to getting a referral stage, you have to do work on the land. So the area of Australia that we are in is undeveloped, so we will be the first mover. So prior to 2019, we had to undertake environmental surveys. We also had to do heritage surveys with the traditional owners, and we had to do some monitoring. So leading into 2019, we'd been in the region since 2014. So we've actually been out in the West Arunta and at Lake Mackay now for 10 years. What you do from there is you then go through various steps with the regulator. And where we've got to now is that this year we have submitted our final proposal to the regulator. It's been a very thorough process to get to this stage. And we now have line of sight to the state government of Western Australia completing their assessment. Now, what that means is that they are assessing on behalf of the state and the Commonwealth, so on behalf of the federal government as well. So the state approval is the big milestone for us. Following that, we do still need Commonwealth approval, but that is a decision stage, not an assessment stage. So we have line of sight to that state process wrapping up in the next few weeks. We're very much looking forward to achieving that milestone, and that will certainly be significant news flow for Agrimin after being in this process for such a significant period of time. Now, while we have been working through the environmental process, we have not rested on our laurels. We have been doing significant technical work. There have been a couple of early movers in Western Australia that went into construction and operation during this timeline that we have been working through approvals. Unfortunately, neither of those have been successful, commercially successful. So what the timeline that we have had has enabled us to do is to spend a lot more time doing really detailed engineering and significant due diligence on why the Western Australian conditions differ to the other places in the world where these processing plants function and have done for decades. Now, we believe we have unlocked that solution, and we have significant technical information that we can share with anyone interested. We can certainly host technical presentations to go through that detail, but we do believe that we have unlocked what the challenge of these WA conditions represent to these processing plants, and we've got the solution. So particularly this year, we've focused on significant test work with leading equipment vendors in the States to make sure that we had tested not just what the success criteria was, but also demonstrated what unsuccessful criteria looked like so that we could show that we've learnt from those early movers. So in addition to doing the process test work, we have also conducted pond and trench trials on the lake surface. So that was a significant investment and a 2-year process. When you're relying on a trenching system and a pond evaporation system like we will be, you really need to do the work beforehand to make sure you understand not just the constructability, but also the operational controls and operational environment conditions that you're going to be dealing with. So 2 years of data and constructability trials have given us a strong level of comfort that we've de-risked the work on the lake surface. I've already mentioned a couple of these other items, but we have had previous engagement with some Australian government funding departments, and we're continuing our engagement with those groups today. In actual fact, we met with one of them today. So we are working through the engagement for potential funding sources now with more energy than we have done due to the fact that we have line of sight to the environmental approvals. We had very mature conversations with a lot of these groups a couple of years ago when we expected the environmental to be faster than it has been. So now we're rejuvenating those conversations and also going out to other markets that have emerged since those earlier conversations took place. I've mentioned that we have the full mine to ship infrastructure and logistics control in place, and we also have 70% binding offtake in place today. Native title we have secured, and as I mentioned in Australia, it is very important that you respectfully and genuinely want to retain those relationships and maintain those relationships. And we have been in the region for a decade, and we do have strong relationships with all of the peoples across the lands. So where to from here? So we do have additional engineering to do. We need to get into full front-end engineering design. We do have a bit more process test work that we would like to do, and we are possibly contemplating a degree of piloting. Now, as everyone on the call would appreciate, piloting can be all different things to all different people. So we are looking at options there on how to optimise a piloting process that would demonstrate to stakeholders that we've learnt the lessons from our predecessors. So we have those lessons learnt at bench scale, but what could we possibly do to improve or increase confidence from investors that we do have the right technical solution? So further engineering and potential piloting is on the horizon. Environmental approval I've spoken to, we are very close. I really do thank everyone that's worked on this project for multiple years to get us to this point. And while it has been frustrating, the Australian system is a good one. It can take 5 to 7 years to get a greenfield mine through the approval process, and we're coming up to 6 years. So we're right in the middle of what could be expected, while of course we would all like it to be much faster. So with the environmental approvals being unlocked, we then have those serious conversations with strategic partners. We have always known that this project would need to have a substantive strategic partner. We're looking at around 30 to 40%, and we're working those, rebuilding those relationships now so that we can start looking at pulling the package together for final investment decision. So in terms of 2025, there will be some opportunities for investment through some tranches of funding that we will be seeking. Those will be linked to the environmental approvals coming through from the state and the Commonwealth, and then we'll be working towards final investment decision. At this stage on our early schedule, commercial production will be 2030, which I know sounds like a long time away, but it does take time to generate the ponds, get the feed salts in them, and obviously go through the evaporation cycles. So the critical path for construction is the on-lake work, coupled with then the logistics transport corridor construction. Now, moving on to the other two pillars that I wanted to talk about today, which is our exploration upside for non-potash commodities and also our investment in Tali resources. So just looking at the left-hand side of the screen there, so the dark blue line that you can see is the outline of Lake Mackay. And what you can see to the left of it are some recent drilling and some recent targets with results. Now, these ones that I'm showing you on the screen at the moment are with two companies, predominantly WA1 and also another company called Encounter. Now, WA1, which has the Luni carbonatite discovery that you can see on, is the closest one to the lake on the sort of the left-hand side of the screen a bit there. So in terms of WA1, they at Luni is the largest and highest grade niobium discovery in the world in the last 70 years. Niobium is a critical mineral on every jurisdiction across the planet. It is it's a very critical mineral because it is used in alloys to strengthen, and it's also specifically used for lower temperature conditions. So, for example, oil and gas, jet engines, that sort of thing. So it's an alloy strengthener, but specifically used in lower temperature conditions. The world at the moment relies on niobium supply predominantly coming out of Brazil, and even in that, there's 80% of our global supply comes from one mine. So you can imagine the excitement with WA1 Luni discovery in Western Australia. There has been exploration in this region for quite a period of time, and it has been touted by Geoscience Australia as a potential copper belt, actually. So looking at the formations and the geoscience information that's available, it was touted that the West Arunta, which is the area surrounding our lake, lake would have a large copper deposit, which it may still, but currently north of the lake, immediately north of Lake Mackay, niobium has been discovered, and with WA1 very significant and high grade. So if you look at the features and I'm looking at the geophysical features there on the screen, what you can see under our lake is that trend continues. Now, we currently have all the agreements in place that we need for potash, but we do need to go back to the traditional owners and seek approval to do exploration for other commodities. So we have commenced those conversations. I'm not saying we will have a drill rig out there next week spinning, because that won't be the outcome, but we do have strong relationships in the region and we are progressing those conversations. So we do see that is a significant potential upside that sits just under the north of our lake. In addition to that, we have a 40% holding in a company called Tali Resources. Now, Tali is a private entity and they have a substantive, if not the largest, land holding across the West Arunta. So the West Arunta is highly prospective, be that for more niobium or copper, as has been suspected by Geoscience Australia in the past. The strike extent that Tali Resources have is significant. You can just see our lake to the top right of that diagram, and our lake is 100 kilometres by 80 kilometres. So showing you the scale of the Tali holding there. Now, Tali is a private entity, as I've said. They also have a 13% ownership in WA1. Now, I'm sure I won't be the first CEO or MD that talks to you today and says that you should buy our stock and that it's undervalued, but it genuinely is. So when you look at our current market cap and you look at our investments, you can see that effectively the market is valuing us as our WA1 see-through value. So that 13% holding through Tali generates most of our market cap at present. So what that means is there is no value being attributed to our drilling potential upside for exploring for non-potash commodities in a highly prospective region that already has significant niobium discoveries in the same trend line. It doesn't value the Tali holding that we own 40% of across the West Arunta, which, as the brokers would tell me, is a very frothy environment at the moment. And thirdly, it doesn't actually value the potash. So the value of Mackay has been reduced over time due to those early movers not being commercially successful, and we need those wins to change. Now, part of that will be us getting our environmental approval and seeing a shift that we can actually build the project. I think, when you're in a process of approvals for 6 years, and also you have some early movers who are unsuccessful, the commodity does have difficulty in the Australian market. However, globally, as I've mentioned through the food security thematic and also the strategic priorities of countries and critical mineral lists changing away from just electrification, we're seeing significant global interest now in the project. We just need to secure the environmental approvals to actually get them over the line. So in terms of upcoming news flow and in terms of what you should be looking out for, I've spoken about the environmental approvals a lot because it is a really significant milestone for us. So state and Commonwealth approvals for those are coming up. In addition to that, we will have some funding processes through next year, and they will be scalable related to the approvals that we get and the technical de-risking that we want to continue to do. The other key thing with activities in 2025 and the related funding is I've already mentioned that on the earliest scheduled commercial production is 2030. We want to do everything we can to protect 2030 for commercial production and set ourselves up, obviously, for any potential acceleration to that timeline. So the work that we'll be doing next year will be to protect the schedule that we have in front of us, look to optimise it where we can, and deliver shareholder value through showing that Mackay can and will be developed, and also making sure that our holding in Tali delivers shareholder value by influencing how that decisions are made around that. And there's lots of optionality for Tali on the table at the moment. And then the third thing is that we are continuing our conversations with traditional owners about potential non-potash exploration across our existing tenure. Please use the QR code, follow us on LinkedIn, and if you would like any further detailed briefing sessions, please connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email, and we would love to hold separate sessions with you. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. We have still a few minutes left for Q&A, so everyone is welcome to post questions in the chat or the Q&A function. And there are already 2 questions in the chat. So first of all, given the traditional reliance on the Mannheim process for SOP production, which generates hydrochloric acids as a byproduct, How has
Mm.
Agrimin secured its supply of sulfuric acids for its operations? Additionally, considering the geopolitical situation with Russia and its potential impact on global supply chains and prices, what measures are being taken to ensure a stable and cost-effective supply?
Yeah, so our primary production process doesn't require any of those inputs. So the solar evaporation ponds do our work for us, and then our processing plant doesn't require those scale of chemical inputs. So our primary production of SOP is very different to the secondary Mannheim production, and it will displace Mannheim additionally because of the ESG credentials and the fact that we don't have those acid byproducts that are very difficult to manage as waste.
And can you elaborate on, or can you discuss your own experience and what you accomplished as a major project in the past few years?
Thank you. That's a different question.
Yeah.
It may have come across when I spoke. I have a projects background. So I was in oil and gas for 24 years and did 16 years back-to-back major projects around the world. And more recently, I've been in mining with a company called Oz Minerals, who were taken over by BHP. But prior to them being taken over, I established the West Musgrave project, which is actually on the same Indigenous lands as Lake Mackay. So I have, significant major project experience, but also working in the desert where we are, and also on the same traditional owner lands.
Another question from the chat. Are there plans to consolidate the share 10-1 to get it out of the penny stock spectrum?
Look, we will always consider all options to optimize shareholder value, but that's not currently on our to-do list at the moment.
And what specific measures will you take to maintain the claim of being the world's lowest cost SOP producers, especially in the face of potential competition or cost escalations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because I'm very conscious that our definitive feasibility study was published a number of years ago now, and that is one of our first activities in 2025 once we can secure some more funding. So we need to get the early contractor involvement happening, and we need to get those DFS assumptions updated. We have been updating them internally, and I remain confident that we will be lowest quartile, but the market needs to see those updates next year. Completely agree.
So we have just 1 minute left on the clock, so maybe you can wrap it up with what investors should look out for and why they should invest, especially with the upcoming investment potential next year in your company.
Thank you. So I say to people, I came for the potash and I'm here for the potash. So when I took on the CEO MD role, I believe in Lake Mackay and I believe in this commodity. And all of those assumptions that I made just over a year ago are even stronger today. So the world needs the product. We have the product and we have a very ESG friendly way of developing it. So the potash is a very significant value for Agrimin, currently not shown in our stock. In addition to that, we've got the exploration upside, and you saw on those trend lines how significant that potential is. So that just needs us to keep working with traditional owners to get access to consider that exploration. And then thirdly, our investment portfolio, there is much more value that can be generated from that. So 40% holding in Tali with a 13% see through to WA1.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for your time, and please follow up.